Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in.
Happy Monday, everybody. I hope you had a restful weekend, and I wish you all a productive week ahead. Since mid-April, a Philippine ship has stood anchored at a stretch of low-lying reefs called Sabina Shoal, 75 nautical miles off the Philippines' western coast. The site lies within 200 nautical miles of the exclusive economic zone of the country, and Manila sent the ship there to keep an eye on the area after it detected an intensifying presence of Chinese fishing militia and maritime research vessels, as well as signs of what it suspects could be preliminary land reclamation. China, for its part, has demanded that the Philippines withdraw the ship. It says much of the South China Sea belongs to Beijing, including the uninhabited Sabina Shoal, which lies 630 nautical miles from China, and rejects a 2016 ruling by an international tribunal that said its claims have no legal basis. We remember last week there was a violent confrontation between the two sides as the Philippines sent a resupply mission to the ship. Both sides blamed each other for the incident. This is all very similar to the situation with the Sierra Madre near the Second Thomas Shoal. And of course, these are all part of the wider escalating tensions between Beijing and US ally the Philippines. These tensions risk blowing up into a regional conflict if mismanaged, and as such we've been following them very closely. To begin today, we follow the developments since last week's collision. In recent days, the Philippines side has suggested diplomacy to address these latest ship collisions. The US and several other countries issued statements of support for the Philippines. Beijing was especially enraged by the US statement. In an official statement, a spokesperson of the Chinese embassy in the Philippines expressed, quote, "If they, the US, genuinely care about peace and stability in the South China Sea, why do they persist in sowing discord and fueling tensions?" End quote. Language employed by Chinese state media has reached a truly concerning pitch too. The Junsheng column of the state-run PLA Daily accused Manila of, quote, boot-licking behavior, end quote, writing, quote, "Turning a blind eye to such goodwill and sincerity from China, Manila has kept making provocations. What's worse, Manila has even gone so far as to wantonly act as a pawn for external forces that wish nothing but chaos and tension for the South China Sea. It is boot-licking behavior and condemned by regional countries." End quote. Dr. Ding Duo, Deputy Director of the National Institute for South China Sea Studies in China, speaking to Singapore-based The Straits Times, said that the Sabina Shoal collisions show that the maritime differences between the two sides are still prominent. Quote, "The level of mutual mistrust is relatively low, and the short-lived detente that had developed earlier is also relatively fragile." End quote, adding that the interaction on the shoal will continue. Quote, "If the Philippines tries to establish a long-term presence on the reef by beaching warships, China will also take tougher countermeasures at sea, in which case a more intense confrontation cannot be ruled out." End quote. Now we must stress this once again. What makes this flashpoint especially dangerous is that Beijing genuinely believes it has the stronger claim to this entire region, despite the global consensus being more on the side of the Philippines. Beijing isn't cynically saying these things. It truly believes this is its sovereign territory and that it is the victim of bullying. It also sees the Philippines as just a US pawn, often completely ignoring Manila's agency and its own native desire to protect its own sovereignty. This folds into the general nationalist zeitgeist in Beijing, which fuels much of China's behavior across all kinds of spaces. Colin Koh, a senior fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore, said that China's modus operandi has long been to gradually encroach on different sites in the South China Sea and unilaterally subvert the status quo. As for Manila, since President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. came to power in 2022, the Philippines' security policies have undergone a shift. Manila has challenged China's presence in the South China Sea, sought to regain the ability to patrol contested areas, broadcast aggressive Chinese tactics to galvanize global support, and strengthened its alliance with the US. Each step of the way, China has doubled down, resulting in risky confrontations at sea. The threat of a dangerous escalation looms large. Indeed, yesterday saw yet another incident. Today, Monday, Philippines Defense Secretary Teodoro told reporters that China's actions in the South China Sea are, quote, patently illegal, end quote, following a clash in disputed waters on Sunday. Yesterday, over what Manila said was a resupply mission for fishermen, expressing, quote, we have to expect these kinds of behavior from China because this is a struggle. We have to be ready to anticipate and to get used to these kinds of acts of China, which are patently illegal, as we have repeatedly said. End quote. Manila's South China Sea Task Force accused Chinese vessels of ramming and using water cannons near Sabina Shoal against a Philippine fisheries vessel transporting food, fuel and medicine for Filipino fishermen. This is the footage which we're currently watching. The Chinese Coast Guard said the Philippine vessel, quote, ignored repeated serious warnings and deliberately approached and rammed our vessels. End quote. Jeremy Chan of Eurasia Group says the likelihood of the invocation of the US-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty, quote, is quite low, as the actions by the China Coast Guard vessels do not rise to the level of a direct attack on a Philippine vessel, and no injuries have been reported by either side. End quote. Let's hope this remains the case. But with this incident yesterday, we are now seeing ship collisions between China and a US military ally on an almost weekly basis. Next up, over the weekend, Brad Setster, former staff economist at the United States Department of the Treasury and current senior fellow at the US-based Council on Foreign Relations, posed an open question to China analysts, providing much food for thought. Quote, how much longer can China sustain its current pace of manufacturing investment? EVs aren't profitable if you're not BYD. Steel industry needs to shrink. PVs are oversupplied. In nominal yuan terms, infrastructure investment, typically funded by local government financing vehicles, has offset the fall in real estate investment. So the increase in investment is more or less in manufacturing, led by autos. Domestic auto demand is flat at around 22 million cars, and on a monthly basis, 1/2 are already EVs, so getting harder for EVs to grow simply by cannibalizing ICE, often JV production. Exports are growing fast, as a trailing 12 million sum, and passenger car exports topped 5 million for the first time. But you can argue, based on the last 4 million of data, that they could soon stabilize at around 1.5 million a quarter, 6 million a year. Real estate investment doesn't look likely to recover anytime soon. The fall in investment is still much smaller than the fall in new starts. So the cyclical contribution of investment to growth looks like it either be from manufacturing or non-existent. It seems from afar that a lot of capital-intensive Chinese manufacturing sectors are struggling to turn a profit after the recent big increase in capacity. But perhaps the best forecast is that China's firms just power on, as they aren't just responding to market signals. End quote. One response was from Peking University's Professor of Finance Michael Pettis, who we quote often. He expressed, quote, I'd say that if manufacturing exports and the trade surplus can keep growing fast enough to absorb the gap in domestic demand, a very big if, in principle they can keep it up as long as they have debt capacity and are willing to use it to transfer manufacturing losses into government balance sheets. I suspect, however, that at some point they'll switch back to subsidizing infrastructure spending. Most prominent economists seem very aware of the risk of relying so heavily on external demand, but few are willing to publicly call for slower, healthier growth. End quote. Next up, we have one more development to cover, but just quickly, if you're enjoying today's episode, don't forget to hit the like button. Liking, sharing, and subscribing tell the algorithm to show this to new people. China Update has not been liked by the algorithm for about a month now. Hopefully we can turn that around and get back to growing. Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are also in the description for those who want to go the extra mile and help keep China Update financially sustainable. Thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. Finally for today, last Thursday, Nepal's 1-month-old government, led by the country's largest communist party, which has close ties to Beijing, formally asked China to convert a $216 million loan the small landlocked country took from Beijing for a new international airport opened last year into a grant, wiping away the debt. It made the request during a visit by a Chinese delegation, including Sun Weidong, China's vice foreign minister, last week. The loan for the airport is part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. However, like some other high-profile white elephants associated with the foreign policy initiative, it has been beset by problems. The airport, which Chinese state-owned firms financed and built, has not attracted any regular international flights, largely because India has refused to grant permission for its carriers to fly in and out of Pokhara, a picturesque city near the Himalayas. In late 2023, US-based The New York Times reported that China CAMC Engineering, the construction arm of a state-owned conglomerate, Sinomac, which was contracted to build the airport, had, quote, inflated the cost of the project and undermined Nepal's efforts to maintain quality control, putting a priority on its own business interests. Nepal's Civil Aviation Authority, the agency overseeing the airport's construction, did not put up much resistance, reluctant to upset Beijing on an important project for both countries. End quote. Soon after this report, Nepal's anti-corruption agency and a parliamentary committee started investigations into the airport's construction. China's Belt and Road Initiative has extended more than $1 trillion in loans and grants for international infrastructure projects. The initiative is part of Beijing's efforts to forge economic and diplomatic ties with other countries, while also getting construction work for its own state-owned enterprises. The initiative has seen some successes, some mixed cases, but also plenty of criticism for costly and poor-quality construction, which can leave borrower countries swamped in debt. On Friday of last week, Nepal's Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister said, quote, we are hopeful, end quote, that China will forgive the hundreds of millions of dollars in debt. Perhaps it's not surprising that a communist thinks debt can be repaid with hopes. But if these hopes prove insufficient to the task, Nepal is scheduled to start repayment of the loan in 2026. But of course, there are other factors at play too. Binod Bastyat, a retired Nepali general working as a researcher at Rangsit University in Thailand, speaking to the New York Times, said that China would probably convert the loan to a grant because it wanted to build a strong relationship with Nepal's Communist Party. He also noted another benefit for China if it agreed to the request. Quote, the investigation into the corruption charges will quickly come to an end. Nobody will talk about that anymore. End quote. And of course, there is the geopolitical dimension too. Last week, Nepal's new foreign minister, Deba, was in India for a series of high-profile meetings, including an audience with India's Prime Minister Modi. The trip comes as Nepal gets a new government, a coalition led by Prime Minister Oli, a leader who in the past has pivoted hard toward China to the detriment of India. In the past, Oli signed a landmark agreement with Beijing to reduce his country's dependence on Indian trade routes. As Mohammad Zaishan, with outlet The Diplomat, noted over the weekend, Nepal is important not just to India but also to the United States. Nested between India and China, in the strategically contested Himalayas, Nepal is an important player in checking China's influence in South Asia. Quote, like other South Asian economies, Nepal sees economic ties with China as a way to break free from New Delhi's historic hegemony. But while Nepal pivots to China, the United States has not stood by idly. In recent years, Washington has tried to build its own presence in Nepal. In 2017, a $500 million compact was signed to build critical infrastructure, including the facilitation of cross-border electricity trade between Nepal and India. Last week, U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Richard Verma was in Kathmandu, pledging $100 million in military support. End quote. Mohammad Zaishan further explains that ordinarily India is very sensitive to such activities in its neighborhood by major world powers. However, quote, New Delhi increasingly recognizes that it might not be able to ward off China's economic influence alone. That has created more space for the U.S. to coordinate with India in neighborhood relations. For New Delhi, such collaboration with the U.S. has become increasingly pivotal. Countries like Nepal have naturally pursued a policy of strategic autonomy by pivoting to China to counterbalance India. Washington's entry into the region with economic assistance programs of its own will be to India's benefit. End quote. Thus, the pieces of the Great Games continue to move, and tensions across the board grow. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Have a good Monday, and I will see you all tomorrow.